Ladies and gentlemen, I would thank you if you could listen to the next panel. We're very happy to have this panel starting. Unfortunately, we're always running short on time. So I've already asked the speakers to maybe limit their remarks to 12 minutes or so we can have some questions at the end, because I think this is a very exciting topic here, social networking and the Arab blogosphere. So we would really probably should get started right now. And I think I'm not going to present or introduce the speakers, because you have all this in the write-up, and it would take too long because they are so good that and they've done so much that it would take too long. So perhaps we will start with Ms. Khamis, who is going to talk to us, and then John Anderson will speak, and perhaps Courtney, Raj, and maybe we'll finish with Mr. Etling. Okay? Please.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you in this great conference here in Georgetown University. I'm Sahar Khamis from University of Maryland, College Park. And my presentation is on changing communication patterns in an Egyptian village, the new media, new communication patterns, and social change in rural Egypt. And before I talk about today's work, or what I'm going to really be presenting in terms of my findings, I want to just give you a small background and some context about how the idea of this whole project started and what was the background behind it. The subject of my own PhD thesis at the University of Maryland was about Egyptian rural women and television's public awareness programs. It was an ethnographic study which I did in an Egyptian village, the village of Kafr Masoud, close to the city of Tanta, in the Delta area in Egypt. And I chose this particular village because I have some relatives there. And it's always a good idea when you have relatives in a part of rural Egypt to actually be able to do your own research there, because it helps you to get to know people and to do some kind of snowballing, which is exactly what I did in terms of my sampling technique. What I did at that time was I actually studied Egyptian rural women and how they interpreted the public awareness campaigns which were televised by the Egyptian government on family planning and literacy. And I did an interview with 30 rural women at that time in the village of Kafr Masoud, and that was in 1989 and 1999. I don't know if the mic is working or not. Can you hear me well? Okay, good. The study relied at the time on in-depth personal interviews and relied on in-depth observation and focus group discussions with these 30 women in order to find out how their own demographic variables such as age, their generation, socioeconomic background, educational background, whether they were housewives or working women, affected how they read the messages in the televised family planning and literacy campaigns on TV. And using Stuart Hall's encoding-decoding model, which tells us that people will interpret media messages differently based on who they are, what their values and beliefs and perceptions are, I tried to find out whether these women came up with identical interpretations of these messages compared to what the government really wanted them to believe or to think, or whether they came up with entirely different understandings. And I found that women had completely different priorities, completely different values, completely different interpretations of their own, which were very different from what the Egyptian government really wanted them to see or to think or to believe. For example, without going into too much details for the sake of time, they read into messages about family planning that showed only a young man and a young woman with 2 kids, that the ideal family should have a boy and a girl. So you keep trying until you get a girl, or you keep trying until you get a boy, because that's the ideal. You should have one of each, and they read into a message about, an affluent urban family of 2 young couple with a lot of, equipment and beautiful things in the household. But if they're young and healthy and they're living in a good standard, that means you should have more children. So it was completely different from what the government was intending, because the government obviously did not study the audience before launching these campaigns. So my new study, I went back again to the same village, the village of Kafr Masoud, 10 years later. That was last summer 2009. Why did I go back? I wanted to conduct some kind of follow-up study 10 years later, to see what has actually changed in the field. What are the new factors of social change? And what are the new types of media infiltrating this rural community? What kind of change is happening in communication patterns among these rural women? How are they changing, and how are their media consumption patterns changing? So I started to collect a new round of data collection in the field based on in-depth personal interviews and in-depth field observation, again, with the women themselves. Why and how did the village of Kafr Masoud change? How did these changes affect the women as media consumers and as communicators? And I was very pleasantly surprised to find out that they remembered me. They asked me, how are you, Mustafa? You know, which is my older son's name, Mustafa. So, how is he doing? Okay, did you have more children? How many did you have? Only 2? Okay, so, you know, anyway, they still remember everything. I want to talk about the village of Kafr Masoud very briefly, the before and after, how it was, you know, 10 or 11 years before, and what it's like now. The first, you know, a very clear finding is the shrinking agricultural life and the shrinking agricultural land and the extinction of farmers. And this is actually one of the villagers, the male villagers, he used this expression, the extinction of farmers. He said there are no farmers anymore. They spend all their time in front of TV, watching satellite channels, as we're going to see in a moment, and they wake up in the morning feeling very tired, they're drowned of energy, they don't have energy to go to the field. And the government does not subsidize, you know, the agricultural products or the fertilizers or anything. So it's very, very costly for them to farm the land. It's much cheaper to go to the bakery store, which opened in the village, surprisingly. So there's no more actual baking inside the home. The agricultural life is really changing and shrinking, and the agricultural land is shrinking as well. The move from extended families to semi-extended or nuclear households, a lot of the older people, you know, the parents and grandparents have died, and a lot of the young people who used to live with them as newly married couples are now on their own, or they prefer to live in independent apartments within the same building. That means a decrease in social cohesion, which is actually due to two-way process or two-way immigration. There is immigration from the village, some of the young people becoming very, you know, aspirational and very motivated. They want to leave the village and search for better opportunities in Tanta, the neighboring city, or even in Cairo. And there is immigration into the village from neighboring areas where people are moving for the first time into the village. Now I'm seeing strangers in the village. Before, 10 years ago, it was like everybody in the whole village are related. They're all uncles and aunts, uncles and aunts. So it was like really strange. But now you see a lot of people who are just looking urban, and they dress urban, and they just, you know, have an urban accent, and they don't know each other anymore. I think there's superficial urbanization because there are a lot of projects on paper. There's a youth center, but it's only you know, a big thing that says a youth center, but there are no youth in the center. There's nothing in the center, no facilities, no equipment, nothing. And the same thing applies to a lot of the facilities there. The literacy class, again, it's a fabulous place. The literacy class, there are no students there, nobody is studying, and we will see why. Poor infrastructure. You know, they were promised 10 years ago that there's going to be a sewage system, a modern sewage system. 10 years later, they're still promised that next year there's going to be a modern sewage system. I think it's combining disadvantages of both rural areas, or rural community, as well as the disadvantages of urbanization. So they have a very unfortunate mix of the disadvantages of being in a rural community with, you know, the poor infrastructure, and also now the disadvantages of urbanization because of the new immigrants in the village, the new strangers, as well as the unemployment rate and the shrinking agricultural land. The new media landscape. 10 years ago, there was only one single household, one single person in the whole village who had a satellite dish. Not surprisingly, people were very skeptical of him. Why does he have this thing on top of his roof? Is he watching pornography all the time? Is he, you know, he must be like a moral corrupter or some kind of, you know, why is he having this? Now, there is a lot of contradiction between heaps of garbage which are uncollected in the village, you know, polluted canals, the lack of modern sewage system and modern infrastructure on one hand, and satellite dishes on the rooftops of many houses in the village, including some mud brick houses. So it's like, you know, how? Okay, it's a little bit startling. The sweeping majority now of people in the village watch satellite TV through indirect means, a wired connection which we call wasla, or the link, from the household of one single person who has a receiver. And in this way, I think we have a phenomenon which I call secondary backdoor users of new media technology. So they're doing it in an indirect way. I think we were talking about this yesterday, that, you know, it is a form of media piracy. But nonetheless, they enjoy hundreds of satellite TV channels for a cost which is as low as 10 Egyptian pounds a month, maybe less than $2 or something. Likewise, one person in the village has high-speed ADSL internet connection, and many houses in the village have a wired connection from this one guy. So young people say, we can get the internet for as low as 10 pounds a month. Again, less than $2. The connection might not be great, the speed is very low, but we can still watch some of our programs and still watch some of our religious shows on the internet, on the computer at home. The sweeping majority of people have their own cell phones, and women are no exception. And that became very popular and became very affordable and very cheap to get your own cell phone. And I think yesterday we're talking about 55 million Egyptians having active cell phone lines. So that is very much in line with the findings we discussed yesterday. It is common to have more than one TV set in the same household. When I was there 10 years ago, it was like one small TV set and that's it. Sometimes black and white, sometimes color TV. Now it is very common to have 2 or 3 TV sets in the same household. That led to a decrease in collectivism and an increase in individuality in the pattern of media reception and pattern of media consumption in the village. The same thing as we have in Cairo to some extent. Instead of having the whole family gather around the 7 p.m. soap opera on Channel 1 on TV, you can now have people doing different things at different times. So a decrease in the form of social cohesion and collectivism that used to prevail 10 years ago. Print media was and still is, of course, very marginal and very limited because of the very high illiteracy rate. Egypt has, unfortunately, more than 45% illiteracy rate, and the rates are particularly high among rural people in particular. So what are the implications of these new changes and this new media landscape in this village? Decreased governmental influence is number one, due to limited exposure to local TV channels. So people do not watch the local TV channels as much anymore, if any. There's very, very limited exposure to these local TV channels, and therefore the Karima Mukhtar, Dr. Karima's very famous family planning campaign that was always broadcasted on local Egyptian TV, nobody watches that anymore because they're watching other satellite channels of their own choice. Muhammad, for example, says, once people get the wasla, which is the connection I was telling you about, they stop watching the local Egyptian TV immediately. They start watching many other channels. My kids even watch programs and movies in English. Increasing the already existing gap between the government's agenda on one hand and people's agenda on the other hand. Remember I told you at the beginning that there isn't a gap between the two agendas, they're not the same. And now the gap has even increased further because the government is saying one thing, but people are not even descending, they're watching entirely different types of channels and media content. Revolution of rising expectations and rising frustrations, especially among young people. A lot of the young people see a lot of the stuff on the media, on the internet, on satellite TV. They want to live a better life, have more affluence, but they have a very high unemployment rate and not enough money to do so. Asma, a 24-year-old educated woman who graduated from the Faculty of Pharmacy in Tanta, neighboring city, says many young people in the village are now unemployed. They spend most of their time in the coffee shop, the qahwa, watching satellite TV, and some of them use the internet cafe in Tanta, or they have their own computers at home. They want many things. They want to imitate the lifestyles they see, but of course they couldn't. Replacing traditional religious authority with new mediated religious figures, especially among young people. So we have, for example, here Suad, an 18-year-old girl saying, although there are now 5 mosques in the village, when I was there 10 years ago, it was only one single mosque, and there was no place for women to pray in the mosque. Now they have 5 mosques, and there is a praying place for women. And there is a special place for women. I really prefer to watch Amr Khalid, Sheikh Mohammed Hassan, and Khalid al-Gindi on satellite TV or the internet, rather than listening to the imam in the mosque. Why is that the case? Because there is more credibility assigned to informal and new religious figures rather than the ones that appear on the national TV, which they call, by the way, the TV sheikhs. And they do not have much credibility in their eye. This created some forms of resistances. Resistance to government's agenda and priorities. People are resisting what the government has to say. They have their own agenda. Resistance to parental authority, because in a lot of the households, the young people now, they have their own computer. It's not easy for the parents to just keep the TV away or lock it up as they used to do 10 years ago. They lock the TV up when the kids have exams. They can't do that anymore. Resistance to extended family influence and traditional authority and authoritative figures like the mother-in-law, because the younger couples are living on their own. Resistance to traditional social norms. A lot of the girls now are